is Dr. Barry Traill, and he's a leading Australian conservationist and an environmental advocate. He has combined his expertise in wildlife ecology and advocacy over 3 decades to secure a large area of Australia's land and sea from environmental threats. He's particularly interested in the interactions between people and the environment and the need to actively manage most Australian landscapes. In 2007, Barry became the Australian Director of the Global Pew Charitable Trusts, a global conservation non-government organisation, and leads their work here in protecting one of the world's great remaining natural areas, the Australian Outback. As part of that work, in October last year, he was co-author with Professor John Winarski and Dr. Carol Booth of The Modern Outback, Nature, People and the Future of Remote Australia. And it's the first in the Outback Papers, a series by Pew, which looks at the future of conservation and development in remote Australia. The Modern Outback outlines, in particular, the international significance of the Outback in an increasingly industrialised and very crowded world, and conversely, the need in the Outback for more people to be on the land and managing it to maintain its health and best ensure a long-term future for people. As well as leading Pew's work in Outback Australia, Barry is a research fellow at the Charles Darwin University. He has worked and travelled extensively throughout remote Australia. Will you welcome Barry Traill?
Thanks very much, Claire. I really appreciate that. And thank you to the organisers for giving me a bit more than the standard length of time. I really appreciate that. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Central Aranda people on the land in which we meet. But I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the Outback lands, which we'll be discussing in various ways over the next few days. As Claire said, I'm the Australian Director for Pew Charitable Trust. We're perhaps not that well known to some of you. In brief, we're a global non-government organisation. In Australia, we seek the protection and management of big natural landscapes and seascapes. One thing I'd mention is that we actually aren't a philanthropic foundation. Despite our charitable trust name, that's a bit of the history. We've changed our status now. And one thing I'll particular perhaps be a theme through my talk is, as a conservation organisation focused in remote Australia, we believe there's a fundamental focus that we have to have and that is needed on the positive role of people in the landscape in different ways. My talk will be in part an outline of the book, the study that Claire mentioned, The Modern Outback, which we're very pleased to launch late last year after a couple of years' work, and it's intended to be the first in the series. But I'll just detail some of the key findings, and I was blessed in having Fred do the lead this morning, because in a sense a lot of it is a follow-on from some of the key themes that Fred really nailed. But first I'd talk about, as a conservationist, as a deep dark green conservationist, on why I think the Outback wilderness needs more people. Most of the world has a lot of people. There are about 7.2 billion people and counting on the planet. And if you can't work out what that is, that's the United States at night, which shows a fair bit of people and industry and so on. So a lot of the planet's industrialised, urbanised, or is in crops. And there's, of course, the other areas which are still retain some naturalness, but of course have been largely or partly alienated for crops and grazing. But most of Australia is actually different to the rest of the world. I think as Australians we can take that, not really recognise that. Most of Australia is like this. It's the Outback. It's an extensive natural landscape. But in the rest of the world, as a consequence of the 7 billion people of us, wanting water, timber, land and minerals, there's less and less wildlife and nature on our planet. But in the Outback, the arid centre, the west and the northern wet dry tropics, the bush is still standing, the rivers are still flowing naturally, and wildlife still moves as it has done over huge distances. And this is very rare now on Earth. Outback Australia, we did an assessment. Outback Australia now ranks alongside the Amazon, the Sahara and the Canadian boreal forests as one of the tiny number, the very small number, of really big natural places left on Earth. However, with probably the very notable exception of the Rangeland Society and many of its members, I found that very few people actually talk about the outback, the rangelands, remote lands, call it what you will, as a singular whole. But it is a real piece of geography, and it's very useful and very powerful, and I think actually quite crucial to our joint endeavours to think about it as a singular whole. To detail that a bit more, because it's not necessarily intuitively obvious, because the outback includes temperate woodlands, such as here in the Great Western Woodlands, the Nadju lands near Kalgoorlie, add to the Sturt Stony Desert, even rainforest on Cape York, through to spinifex and sand country, and of course tropical savannas. So this is a great variation in ecosystems and vegetation, and that can obscure, I think, that detail can obscure for ecologists like myself and other land managers the important vital fact when we think about conservation, about land management, about people, is the geopolitics, the geography and the politics of these landscapes is very similar. So the outback has key attributes which are very similar, in fact, in many cases identical, right across the spread. Very quickly, land tenures, they're mostly pastoral, indigenous and conservation rather than freehold in the more crowded part of Australia. Low to very low population densities, a high proportion of indigenous people, and their rights tend to have been much stronger than the more closely settled country. It's a simple resource-based economy, seasonally harsh, which adds to the fact that the isolation factor is very strong and it's isolated from the centre of powers. And a bit of something I mentioned once or twice, it's red. Most of the country has sand, rock, or poor and leach soils, and that matters in terms of how it's been settled. So if you can put it another way, if you're a Nadju ranger managing a country in the Great Western Woodlands, or a grazier near Alice, near here, or a national park ranger in Cape York, you face a remarkably similar set of issues, threats. Fire, weeds, ferals, isolation, and often the difficulty in maintaining buildings, social infrastructure and built infrastructure for your family and your workforce and your colleagues. And you live in a landscape with a similar mixture of tenures and industries, pastoral lands, indigenous lands, some parks, some mining. And across that, a key overall point, and perhaps a deceptively simple point, which I think we all get, but it's worth nailing, is that a principal problem for conservation, for land management, for nature as a whole in remote Australia is not a problem of too many people, as in most of the planet, too many people wanting resources. It's actually too few people, or to be more precise, too little land management by too few land managers. So most of the outback lands, I'm being precise here, most of the outback lands, including many or most of its conservation reserves, actually has fewer people on it, non-Indigenous or Indigenous, managing it than at any time over the last 30 to 50,000 years. The country has got emptier over the last century or two. And this matters for the health of the ecosystems. I'm not going to belabor the point, which you know, but managing it, those fire, those weeds, those ferals, managing the potential impacts of pastoralism, mining, tourism, we need active land management. So the wilderness, a term I'm quite happy to use, needs more people, more land managers, not fewer. So for me, as a conservationist, this leads to questions we've all dealt with in various ways, big or small, I think. If we want people in the landscape, what are the economic and social policy settings that will work best for people, and who's going to pay for that support and how? And if we're asking Australians, as Fred, I think, very neatly articulated in a number of ways, asking the 96% of Australians who don't live in the outback to pay for some of that, to support that, via taxes or other means, is a crucial question, is why should they do that? Why should they pay for a better road to a small outback town, say Windora, of 100 people, or monitoring pastoral condition on a property which is run by a couple? Or why should they put a school in a small, remote Aboriginal community who don't want to move to Yuendamu or Alice? if you're asking governments to put time and focus into getting better policies in place, if less than 4% of the population lives there, why should they? Not unreasonably, the other 96% of Australians in our democracy need attention as well. So I want to tell a couple of stories which I think illustrate this point and the practicalities of the point. About 2 years ago, we did some qualitative polling, focus groups is the jargon, testing what West Australians thought and knew about the West Australian outback. And we showed them a map of Western Australian rangelands outback and asked them some open-ended questions on what they knew about it. And there were a range of responses, but when we summarised them, there were a few standout themes. They did think the West Australian outback was special because it was big and natural. They thought it was red. They were very consistent. Red was the standout, most common adjective used to describe it. And they thought, and this was a surprise, they thought it was mostly in national parks. And when we asked how much of the West Australian outback was already in conservation parks, reserves, they said 50 to 60% plus. Some said a lot more. Now, in fact, less than 15% is in conservation reserves. Now, the point of that, I'm not trying to make parks out as a be-all and end-all at all, but of course for the headset of those people is that they thought the outback was special, they think it's big, they think it's red, and they love it, and they know very little about it, but they already think it's looked after because they're equating park equals protection equals good management equals she's all right, she's okay, no problems. And, you know, in case there are any social scientists in the audience, look, these were qualitative findings, but it fits with a lot of discussions I've had over the last decade with people in Australia and also overseas, these consistent themes. And the second story is from last year. And with some colleagues, I met a couple of people, a couple of officials in the West Australian Department of Premier and Cabinet. And these were not some empty, uncaring bureaucrats. They're good guys, they're smart, very straight talking, and I know they're passionate about protecting the environment and good policy. And we were seeking their early engagement on reforms to allow diversification of pastoral leases in the West Australian pastoral zone. Because as some of you know, a very high proportion of the West Australian pastoral leases are conservatively judged as not being viable long-term for pastoralism. So where to for those leases? So we put it to them to seek their early engagement of the government. And they just flat out bluntly were not interested. You know, why would Premier, you know, these were their comments, why would Premier Barnett and the Cabinet be interested? There's no significant income coming from the southern rangelands in Western Australia. There wasn't any public knowledge of the problem. It wasn't a public or political issue. In fact, you know, only several hundred people actually knew anything about it. And these two things are related, of course. I wasn't surprised at that reaction from those good bureaucrats. Neither we nor others have been successful in creating the public impetus and understanding for that change. Or to put it more simply, if the public and political decision makers don't know there's a problem, i.e. they think the outback's all protected already, then there's no point trying to come up to them with a solution. So if you just jump forward a bit and just let's compare that with another big, iconic Australian place, the Great Barrier Reef. For the reef, like the outback, there is widespread understanding of the value of the place. There is widespread knowledge, unlike the outback, there's widespread knowledge that the reef has problems. And this doesn't mean that decisions by governments on the reef are always spot on for the environment, but as you may have noticed during the current debate about coal ports and dredging on the reef coast, the federal government, the Queensland government, take it very seriously and have put in a lot of resources, a lot of political energy. And the reef and its future was one of the issues that definitely swung several seats in the last Queensland election, which brought in a new government. So what does this mean for us who are interested in this, the bigger outback? First of all, you might have clocked that I keep talking about the outback and only occasionally to the rangelands or remote Australia. This is very, very deliberate. If you want to have attention on something, you need to give it a name. And we are already fortunate in having a name that is already widely known and used and loved by Australians and also people overseas. I don't especially want to get in here into a too narrow discussion about branding. We can still use names like Rangelands and Remote Australia amongst ourselves, but in public I do think it's much better, much more powerful to use the name of the Outback, which people already love, already treasure, already brings up a whole series of very positive responses and emotions. Secondly, when we released the Outback report, I occasionally had questions from journalists and others of, well, what do you want? You know, you put out a report, what do you want? And someone asked me, what do you want from Greg Hunt, the Federal Environment Minister? No cynicism from the audience. And underlying that question, I think, was a probe of what is the, you know, what are just the things you want right now? Now, of course, we at Kew do have specific big projects we're focused on to get better protection and management in place. Two of them I've alluded to, getting diversification of pastoral leases in Western Australia. Second is continuing to work with Indigenous organisations to keep building the financial support that has driven the incredibly successful Indigenous land management movement. But our intent with starting the Outback Papers series and the intent of me giving this talk isn't trying to get some quick grab for this particular project, grab of support. It's to systematically start the process of getting beyond its red and its protected level of knowledge. And in saying that, I don't think the people who made those comments, broad Australians, are stupid. They're not stupid. Ignorance is not stupidity. It is a collective comment on ourselves, and I think all of us over time, as we so far have not done enough to communicate simply, elegantly and powerfully what's needed. So these are the key pieces of information that we've started with, and I'll put them out there. We don't think it's the be-all and end-all, and appreciate, of course, further discussion down the track. First of all, with the Outback, it's rare and it's special. And it's rare and special not just for Australia, it's rare and special globally. It faces threats. It has many different regions and ecosystems, but they all face a similar suite: fireweeds, ferals and so on. It needs active management. We need people on the ground to manage it. That is very new information to most Australians. Most Australians do not think that nature needs to be managed. And lastly, an important one, which I find very compelling, and I think others have found compelling at times as well. The Outback's not just a place for dusty nostalgia. You know, the Outback, for some people, can be seen as just, you know, some sweaty stockman pushing some cattle, Chips Rafferty type stuff, or, you know, venerable Aboriginal elders being at one with the land. Of course, that is still real. That is still that is still there. But the Outback is also modern already. It's there. It's Indigenous rangers fighting fire with satellites and helicopters. It's carbon farming. It's pastoralists managing cattle and water points through mobile phones and satellites. There's a whole range of innovations happening again, which most Australians do not know much about, little or nothing about. So for us, it's a work in progress. It's something we collectively, I think we need to think more on. And I want to discuss, you know, with your organisations and other allies. One of the immediate things I'd like to say that we are working on for the Outback as a whole, which I do think has got some great potential, is we're planning a series of public forums in the bush, but also probably particularly in capital cities, especially Canberra, with the Rangelands NRM Alliance. And we're looking, touch wood, we'll have the Australian newspaper to back that, as we did when we had the launch of the Modern Outback study. Because we can see that's a way really just, again, the next brick in the wall. It won't happen quickly, but the next brick in the wall of getting better public understanding. So to finish, look, I think we've got a choice. We can continue perhaps a more patchy and piecemeal engagement with the rest of Australia on the what, why and how, and the need for the Outback, for wildlife, for people, for country. And I'll go back to what Fred said, I think it's really pointed out, we do need to be opportunistic. There's some PowerPoints there. It was a brilliant piece of work, by a range of people in Western Australia with royalties for regions to get that money flowing back rather than up or sideways or down, I think, to Perth, down to Perth. There will be other opportunities we need to take, but I think that needs to be part of this bigger whole, and I'm loath to use the word because it's overused by marketing people, narrative, the story of what the Outback is, what it needs. That's what we need. And it's a harder road. It does take more time and effort. It does take more collaboration to get our communications aligned and out to the rest of the continent. And it can't just be simple rhetoric. There have to be solid policies underneath that. But more and more over the last few years, I've been very taken just by the depth of the policy depth, the real depth of programs that are already in place. You know, the information on governance and government delivery work done by the Desert Knowledge CRC, the understanding of and the movement on diversification of pastoral leases in different jurisdictions, and the establishment again of the huge Indigenous land management program. And over the last decade more, the rise, development and sophistication of all the rangelands NRM operations. They're just to name a few. We do have the sophistication, the policy depth there. If we can add to that, I think something that is a vision splendid of what in the Outback we're jointly seeking. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry. We've got 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for Barry, there's roving mics, and put your hand up. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. That was great. It's a little bit of a parochial question, given I live in the Mulga country. I'm just wondering how you drew the boundaries for the modern Outback, which kind of takes in Cape York but excludes the Mulga country like Burke and Charleville.
Yeah, a few people have asked that, and it comes up quite a bit. There's a precision of, we've got a map in the Outback, which is where we drew the line. Firstly, I'd say I don't think it matters exactly where you draw the line. Different people have different boundaries, and I don't think it matters at any level, particularly because it's not a sharp boundary. We drew the line based on areas that was perhaps a bit more technical, of areas, IBA regions, bioregions, that fulfilled a certain level of criteria of naturalness. So it's probably a bit more of a reductionist biological conservation focus on the Outback.
Yeah, Rod Sefter in Western Australia. Barry, thanks for that. And I've heard the presentation before, and it's great. But how do you intend to roll out your campaign of gaining this public awareness, please? Thank you.
Yeah. I said for us, for just what the resources we put in, sort of a cornerstone will be our Outback paper series, which is, we don't have a set number of papers on that. We see that as ongoing. At some stage we'll decide that it's hopefully, touch wood, done its job of helping build that education and knowledge. So this was the sort of foundation start, and other papers will come. We'll look at a range of things in and out of scale. It could be more specific. We've been talking just very early discussions with Jenny Davis about possibly a paper on water in the Outback. The next one, though, almost certainly will be people, land managers in the Outback, which will be a mix of perhaps more photojournalism, for want of a better word, specific vignettes on individual land managers and what they do, pastoralists, miners, Aboriginal rangers, national parks rangers, and then wrapped around that specific text of why they do it, what's important, what that delivers. So that's part of it. The other thing which is really seeking a range of collaborations. I don't want to overstate that because we're a small group and we can't do everything, but start a range of conversations such as we're having with NRM Alliance about possibly some forums or other ways of getting the message out. So there's not, in starting a new, I guess, way of conceptualising the Outback, in part what we do, we are not seeking to communicate something that's new. In my view, the information is already there, the understanding is already there, it's in this room and in another 1,000 people like us. It's about seeking to systematically and consciously and repetitively engaging with the public and decision makers with a bigger frame. And that's done with some systematic stuff, such as the Outback papers, such as some forums, and it's done in 101 ways of individual conversations, social media that your organisations or you as individuals might do in talking about not only the local work, the regional work, but seeking to put that in a bigger frame. An example, I was just talking to some KJ people at a parallel meeting just a couple of hours ago, and of course they have these extraordinary stories. People learn mostly through stories. They don't mostly learn through facts like overtrained scientists do. And of course KJ has incredible stories from Mardu rangers who've had often extraordinary personal lives, of where they're to and what they do on the land, and getting that out in public more. Just drip feed, getting more media on that. That's what will do the job. Other question?
I'm just wondering, is that have you engaged with any similar efforts or learnings from international settings?
Yes. This is a lot of, it's not a copy, but there's a lot I learned from colleagues at Pew and Canadians who 10 years ago, 12 years ago, established what's now known as the Canadian Boreal Forests Campaign Project. Prior to their work, the Boreal Forest, the biggest forest in the world, stretches right across northern Canada, it's mostly conifer forests, was known by 101 names, the equivalent of the Kimberley, the Channel Country, etc., 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 in Canada. It did not have one unifying name. Only nerdy botanists called it the Boreal Forests. And over a 2-year period, ourselves and others systematically and in a focused way talked about the boreal, its generic threats, its generic solutions for Indigenous people, for non-Indigenous people in those regions. And it was quite transformative in how Canadians, who similar to us were mostly separate from those forests, saw it and perceived it. It can work. It's not just a bit of gee whiz, let's just stick a name on. I do think it's a fundamental way of viewing, talking and communicating.